a little bit on the impacts of tariffs. We've already had that conversation in the agriculture context. We might hear about it in forest products as well. And this will be sort of round one. Next week, we're going to also hear from the Forest Products Association and perhaps some folks from the logging community as well. But I know we have different levels of expertise on the committee. Some of us have a pretty good understanding of the different. So it's leaving aside tariffs. Just we have different levels of understanding of the markets for different products, and now throwing in the tariffs piece on that suddenly gets even more interesting. So thank you for joining us this morning, Catherine and Oliver, and we'll let you begin the presentation.
Thank you, Chair Durfee, and thanks to members of the committee for having us. Introduce myself, I'm Oliver Pearson, the Director of Forests with Vermont Forest Parks and Rec.
Catherine Servideo, I'm the Forest Economy Program Manager.
Welcome back.
We'll tag team this presentation and speak to you about the impacts of tariffs on the forest products sector in Vermont. I'll just add that we're also joined by a colleague named Chris Castano, who works for a company called Maine Woods, but is based in Vermont. And he's like you said, when VFPA reps come in, he's living and breathing and feeling the impacts of the uncertainty created by this situation. So there may be some benefit to him giving us a few remarks if time allows at the end. But what we'll share with you today is some background information, the sort of level set, like what the current state of play, what we know, what's happening with current and potential future tariffs on wood products, the impacts on the sector here in Vermont, and then sort of outlook, including some thoughts on if tariffs come, if they don't come in, what can be done to support this sector, given the uncertainty that's created by this current situation.
And I think you may have just said this, but I mean, I have no idea whether there have been tariffs, whether, a year ago, there were tariffs, 10 years ago. So I think it'll be helpful to understand that.
Yep. Yeah, we won't spend a lot of time talking about the last time that tariffs were in place during the first Trump administration, but we can talk about what's in place today already and what's coming. So just some background information, that the main thrust of the conversation around tariffs for us here in Vermont is if there are tariffs put in place on import of wood products from Canada and export of our products from Vermont north. So to frame that, Canada is Vermont's largest international trading partner. Some of the statistics that we found that in 2024, Vermont imported almost $2.5 billion worth of goods from Canada and exported about $645 million worth of goods north. So any disruption, any changes to sort of free trade agreements and our trade with Quebec and Canada will be disruptive, at least in the short term, if not short and long term. And I think that's one of the themes that you'll hear us talk about in this presentation is that tariffs can create challenges, tariffs can create opportunities. Right now, we're feeling that it's more of the former, more challenges than opportunities. In terms of what we export, Canada is our biggest export market for hardwood lumber and saw logs. So foresters use a term 1,000 board feet. So this figure, 21,691,000 board feet, is essentially equivalent to 21.7 million board feet. But we have exported it, and our most recent figures are from 2022. We exported 21,600 board feet, 1,000 board feet to Canada. And that is about 52% of the saw logs that are sent out of state. So the other 48% is a mix of overseas, but more so to adjacent states where there's some milling capacity. Representative Nuss.
Yeah, thank you. So excluding the 4% of saw logs that go overseas, how many of those million board feet go up to Canada, get sawed and brought back into the States? Probably a high percentage.
Yeah, I don't have exact numbers, but I would say yes, a high percentage would come.
So why would anyone think it was a good idea to tariff it going up and tariff it coming back if it was our product? So you I could go to Canada and buy parts for my tractors made in the US. And there was no duty, no import yet. The $10 import fee or duty or anything was null and void if it was an American part. sold in Canada, through Case IH. So why wouldn't it be the same for timber? Going up, sod coming back, like out, like back.
Well, could you answer that question? Because I mean, I think it's a legitimate, you were maybe saying it rhetorically, but why would somebody think it's a good idea? And there's an answer to that, perhaps.
Perhaps. When tariffs were being discussed earlier in the Trump administration, in Canada, this was back in late January, announced its potential retaliatory tariffs. Originally, they would exempt saw logs entering Canada from the US, raw unpeeled saw logs, from their import tariffs of American goods. However, the dynamics and the discussions had changed, and nationalism has entered the debate as lots of comments are made. And so Canada has, we believe, changed its perspective to be saying now we will charge tariffs on imported raw logs from the US. And some of those, particularly softwood lumber, is milled in Canada and comes back into the US to support housing construction and other needs in the US. We would, under current federal plans, that would be charged a tariff as it entered the United States. Why that makes sense? Why are the two federal governments are interacting that way? I don't think I really want to comment on that, but we're just sort of looking at what we know of what is said to be happening and what the impacts could be on the sector.
Right. Let's keep going. Representative Berg.
I mean, small comment with regard to it, but I mean, I see the merit in it if it was, I don't see the merit in tariff war, but if there were a certain level of tariffs that would make it so that, okay, maybe we should bring the sawmills back to the US, right? And make our own lumber here. I see the merit in making that happen, in sending logs to Canada just to have the lumber come back down. Yeah, so.
Yeah. Probably don't want to get a policy debate, but we have to have people who work in those sawmills.
The theory around reducing or eliminating competition through tariffs, certainly at the point you made, Representative Burt, conceptually, directly makes sense. But we look at if, and we'll get into this in the presentation, but even if we had certainty, 4 years, we knew this is what's going to be a policy decision by the federal government that we have to live with. It wouldn't be tomorrow, it wouldn't even be a year or two from now when we'd be able to stand up additional processing capacity. And I'll talk about why as we get through the presentation. So yeah, and as we said, about 4% of saw logs leave Vermont overseas. Most of that is China, to a lesser extent Vietnam. So that's what we're exporting right now. These export markets are essential to the viability of Vermont's forest products sector. For example, the 4% going overseas looks like a small amount, but historically in the last few years, that's been one of the principal buyers of ash and red maple. And so that market dries up because of tariffs, that'll have impacts on forest management, that'll have impacts on what loggers can take off the forest in a given job, and that'll have impacts on what kind of loads can be delivered to mills, because people have to be more specific. I can accept this, but I can't accept that because there's no market for that. So it's a small amount, but it would have a big impact. And looking at the exchange rate, looking at these new tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, they could really combine to stop the flow of products leaving Vermont going north to Canada. And we'll talk about what's happening with exports to China in a minute here. Just in terms of imports, to sort of share that piece, we as a country, not just Vermont, import significant amounts of softwood lumber. 25% of softwood lumber consumed countrywide was imported from Canada. So that's a huge amount. Tariffs will increase the cost of these items, affect supply. New housing construction, particularly affordable housing construction, will become more difficult. And to give you an idea of what that looked like, so to your question, Representative Nelson, we imported $52 million worth of sawwood products from Canada in 2024. So that's a good amount. And some of that would be wood that we sent across, was milled there and came back. Not all of it, but so.
Well, same as, I mean, yeah, it may not have been that pine that came off from one of Jed's jobs that came back. It might have been a pine that was grown in Stansted, but maybe your pine ended up in Montreal.
There's a lot of pine that goes to West Brom, for instance, from north. We still have some viable, very few, but very high quality pine markets here in Vermont and Hampshire.
So just sort of to wrap up this part, forests don't recognize borders. Logging and forest products industry along our northern borders is more successful when trade relations are steady, measured, when existing trade rules and agreements are complied with. and that sort of movement of products can happen freely, taking advantage of processing capacity where forests are, where certain species are. One of our industry partners, the Professional Logging Contractors of the Northeast, issued a statement earlier after the Trump administration began speaking about tariffs. But you know what, that's what's here in italics in the middle. But sort of the key takeaway point here is that if there is this trade war that's protracted, it could be expected to put some U.S. loggers out of business. And yeah, that's that. Just for additional context, that's on top of, as you've heard us say many times in this room before, challenges that the industry is already facing for other reasons: climate change, market variability, workforce issues. So, as you know, Vermont's lost 2 major sawmills and a recycled paper mill, and many logging companies over the last 2 years. So you add tariffs on top of those challenges, and it's going to create very difficult conditions for the sector. So Catherine will take over here, just kind of walk you through what we know about the current state of play.
Yeah, so this is,
Just quickly, where was the recycled paper mill? Okay.
so this is just a very abbreviated timeline of the tariffs from February 1st to roughly today, and looking a little bit into the future. So I think one thing I just want to impress on this is the level of change that has happened in very, very short amount of time, and the uncertainty that brings to everybody who's looking at this. So this all started, really kicked off in early February when the United States announced the intention to do tariffs. So they said 25% on Canadian goods and Mexican goods, 10% on China, and then an additional 10% on energy imports from Canada. On the 3rd, they announced that they would delay those 25% for 30 tariffs on Canada and Mexico for 30 days. And then February 4th is when 10% tariff on Chinese imports went into effect. March 1st, the White House announced an investigation into the effects on national security of imports of timber, lumber, and related products. A couple days after that is when the 30-day delay from February expired. And so those 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods were implemented, and there was an additional 10% on Chinese products. So that then brought the Chinese tariffs up to 20%. In response, Canada imposed reciprocal tariffs and also issued a notice of intent to implement an additional tariff on additional products, so 25% on additional products. They provided a list of the products that they would be tariffing. And on the same day, China announced that they would not be accepting the phytosanitary certificates from USDA for log imports from the United States, effectively banning US logs from traveling to China. On the 5th, thanks.
Sure.
Yeah, so I did add a little bit of context to that. Canadian 25% tariffs on the US goods, that includes lumber, veneer, flooring, OSB, panels, furniture. And then that notice of intent, that includes additional products, including what's referred to as wood in the rough. So that would be our logs or roughly squared numbers. That's currently under a comment period for Canadians that's set to expire in April. So on March 5th, the US announced an exemption or a delay, another delay on the 25% tariffs for US automakers for any products covered under the current trade agreement, the USMCA. And then the following day announced the 1-month delay until April 2nd. Again, so it's a repeat of what happened in February. And then March 12th, we have tariffs on steel and aluminum. 13th, Canada does additional tariffs in response to the steel and aluminum tariffs. And so now we're all waiting to see what happens next week with whether or not the tariffs will go into effect on April 2nd. So one thing to know here under the USMCA, what you were talking about, Representative Nelson, where logs go north and the lumber comes back, why would you tariff that? Under the USMCA, those are considered domestic origin, so they wouldn't be. When they introduce new tariffs and you're not under that trade agreement anymore, that's when those tariffs come into play. That's for hardwood. Softwood does currently have duties on them, it has for a long time. So currently it's at about 14.5% tariffs on softwood lumber from Canada. The 25% tariff would be on top of that. So you're looking at a close to 40% tariff. softwood lumber.
Representative Bosler?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I'm perplexed by what the national security implications of importing wood could be. Like, can you just help me think what does that mean?
Yeah, I'm not the best person to answer this, but I think a good example would be, what Representative Burt talks about, where that is kind of a reshoring of manufacturing and kind of it's a protectionist stance where we're ensuring that we have capacity to produce these products and are not reliant on others.
So increasing our self-sufficiency if we don't have imports?
I think there's the.
Canada cut off unilaterally exports of softwood lumber to the US tomorrow.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have, for some period of time, enough softwood lumber to meet our domestic housing construction needs.
Yeah.
Which creates a potential national security challenge.
Okay.
Kind of like a 30 by 30.
Representative Burt?
Would that also include like concerns about the emerald ash borer, things like that as well, like things that imported with wood could potentially bring for diseases and pests to our country? Is that potentially a part of that conversation?
It could be, yeah.
The executive order, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, that highlighted that investigation. I read it a few weeks ago. I don't recall invasive species being on the sort of list of factors driving this investigation, but you're certainly right that introduced pests from outside the US could negatively impact the quality of not only our forests, but our wood products, and that could be factored into any investigation.
Representative Lipscomb?
I need to underscore Oliver Pearson's point, Greg. Vermont, New England in general has lost about 97% of its manufacturing capacity over the last 45 to 50 years. For many reasons, energy, insurance, regulations, workforce, that is not coming back in my lifetime, no matter what happens. So we can't gear up like for wartime and all of a sudden reopen abandoned and dismantled mills. But the point of pests, that pest is killed through the kilning aspect. So whatever is processed, whether it's a white ash log that's shipped to Canada, processed and kiln dry, that pest is mitigated. So, and then they go all over the world, including China. I think the point that goes north, softwood, which is spruce fir, traditionally is a Northeast product that is critical for framing and construction. That heavily comes back. The rest goes to Asia, goes to Belgium, Germany, Czech Republic, it goes to Vietnam, everywhere. So that spreads out globally.
I'm going to ask Catherine this, although I could ask you, Jed, I'm sure. And you just answered the question partly, but softwood, just in terms of housing or construction, can you talk a little bit about softwood versus hardwood? And maybe it's all softwood used in housing construction? I don't know.
Mostly, so softwood, kind of your conventional lumber, you're gonna use for framing. And the hardwoods is where you get more of a finishing in your home. So that's where cabinetry can happen, furniture, flooring is really big, but the lumber that you use to build your walls and frames, that's gonna be softwood. And we don't have the capacity to meet our needs right now.
Gentlemen, I think hearing from Chris will be important because he's an entrepreneur that, although it's a sort of a niche market, he's actually trying to manufacture, produce a product here. And at some point before we punch out around noon, I think that'll be.
Do we have Chris on the agenda for another meeting? When? Not at the moment. Okay, well, let's see where we are.
Yeah, but to that point, this slide gets into some comments that we picked up from media reports about the impacts of tariffs on the industry. And this is stuff that Chris is living and breathing right now. So if the tariffs are imposed in April, our understanding is lumber and building supply companies would not be able to absorb the resulting price hikes and pass the extra costs on the consumers. Higher prices could drive customers away, cause disputes about, oh, you told me it's going to cost this, why is it that? And some small businesses felt this could really damage their reputation in their communities. So just some quotes from people operating in the space. The gentleman who runs a millworks in New Hampshire said, all of our contracts and sales documents are not going to put a disclaimer that should tariffs go into place, customer is responsible to cover those costs. So consumers will feel the brunt of these cost increases. And then from at a larger scale, a representative from the Northeast Retail Lumber Association basically spoke to how orders are being canceled, prices need to be renegotiated, and because of the high volumes and low margins, these prices are going to be passed on to consumers within about a week. One impact that we're seeing is lumber future prices are at their highest already since August 2022 due to supply constraints and tariff uncertainties. By itself, lumber prices have been low coming out of sort of post-pandemic. So there's some increased prices to a certain extent. It's not all bad, but now that they're going up, driven by these supply constraints, which are indirectly related to tariff and uncertainties created by tariffs, that's also going to be felt by consumers as well. So that's one of the main impacts we're seeing of tariffs on housing, which is a priority for many states, including Vermont right now. Material costs for all construction materials, steel, wood, other things have already increased by 40% just because of inflation nationwide over the past 5 years. And Vermont is one of the states with the highest construction costs. While these higher building costs can sort of be offset by raising rents or higher sale prices, that's less feasible in rural areas where people's incomes can't really keep up with the increase in costs. And so what we read is the tariffs could increase material costs, so not just wood, but wood, steel, aluminum, everything, by almost $10,000 for a typical new single-family home. This will mean that there'll be reduced profit margins for developers, making affordable housing harder to get into place. And this will sort of have a chilling effect on investment, where investors who are sometimes driving these larger housing development projects will be less willing to invest, effectively slowing housing development. So you can see the trickle-down effect of the tariffs on efforts, including here in Vermont, to get additional affordable housing in place. So looking at what's happening at the national level, the White House has issued 2 executive orders on lumber. There's an order to expand American timber production on federal lands. This is something that the Trump administration did when they were in office the first time. Essentially, how can we streamline the regulatory process and ensure forests are healthy through things like fuel reduction and reduction of fire, addressing invasive species, to Representative Britt's comment, to collectively increase production of wood coming off federal land. So that's out there. There's also, as Catherine mentioned, the study to examine if imports are threatening national security. So those are some efforts that I think the Trump administration feels that will go hand in hand with tariffs should they be imposed to, if we're losing supply of wood that we're importing, this executive order on expanding production is successfully implemented, that could perhaps offset that reduction. Congress is debating a very similar act, the Fix Our Forests Act, to that executive order, which would streamline regulatory review and increase production coming from federal lands. And there will be those that support that, and there will be those that oppose it, and we'll see how that bill ends up, if it does pass, what form it takes. And so thinking about this, if we want to reduce reliance on imported lumber and increase domestic production, 2 things are needed: additional supply, additional harvesting from either public lands, state and federal, or private lands, as well as increased processing capacity. And as we think about that, we note that the regional trends in the Northeast have been going in the opposite direction over the last 10 years. Production and supply has been decreasing, driven by climate change, changing landowner preferences, market variability, and sort of the pro-forestation movement. And processing, as Representative Lipsky just said, has been decreasing, driven by weak lumber market, limited supply, in some places regulations and jurisdictions, operational costs, and labor shortages. So we're seeing some trends in our region going in the opposite direction of what's really needed to offset the impacts of tariffs and take advantage of a situation where competition from other countries is reduced. I'm going to hand it off to Catherine here. We're sort of getting into now, what can we do in Vermont to deal with this situation and help the wood products industry adapt and continue to operate under these challenging situations.
So, some of the tools that are at our disposal, we do have the Vermont Forest Future Strategic Roadmap. I know I've talked about it a couple of times, I think, now in here. But it has a number of actions intended to support vibrant forest product sector here in Vermont. We do have the implementation steering committee, and there's 2 members here of that committee. We do have a grant in place right now. It is a federal grant, but we have a grant to begin implementation of the roadmap, and the priority work that we'll be doing includes workforce development, training opportunities, and some outreach and communication around the importance of the forest economy in the sector to the region. So just kind of it's more of the outlook of what's happening, how this is affecting Vermont or what we can do. So the supply of logs has been a constraint for the forest product sector. Oliver, do you want to?
I mean, we just, up until this winter, and you've heard this from professional logging contractors, Sam Lincoln, the challenges of harvesting wood because of climatic issues with warm winters and very wet summers. So up until this winter, which did have good conditions, supply was a constraint. We as FPR have acknowledged that we can do a bit to address that by working to increase the amount of wood that's sustainably harvested from state lands, but you know, our state lands that we manage are less than 10% of the state, and so we're a drop in the bucket of what's needed to turn that around. I think this winter has led to sort of an uptick in supply, and now there's some market challenges, including the situation created by tariffs. So this constraint is something that's going to ebb and flow, but we are thinking into the future of, you know, is there a role that we can play in Vermont to support the sector? And one option there is to do a bit more, you know, sustainable harvesting on state lands, but that by itself isn't enough. And as I say in the second bullet here, it needs to be a regional or national effort if we're really going to use increased supply from U.S. lands, public or private, to offset reductions in supply from tariffs.
Representative O'Brien.
If the tariffs go forward, is this an opportunity for anybody, whether it's commercial or even national?
Yes, I mean, I think potentially, if you take kind of a long view, as long as there's some certainty in the tariffs, then yes, there is a potential opportunity there. But I think we don't know that they'll go into place, and if they do go into place, we don't know for how long. And the practical challenge is that it takes several years to stand up new mills. Lots of money, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. And when there's that level of uncertainty that you don't know that the conditions that are inciting you to do that mill, that new facility, are going to be there when it's ready, is a chilling factor. But also, we have a challenge with staffing the jobs that we currently have. Staffing a whole new facility is a whole different magnitude of a challenge. And we don't know what the consumer demand will be like for those products in the future. So there's too many unknowns to really know for sure.
But also, right, Canada might see it as an opportunity for them to develop more of their own, national industry. So Vermont logs going to Canada in 10 years that market may be gone for other reasons, right?
Yeah, their land ownership is a little bit different than ours, so they have some unique situations as well.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, and it's a question. As this committee learned when we went to the Little River Park, how complex, how many years it takes to get from the conception and planning and permitting, public input, a very tiny but important and effective harvest, mostly for migratory bird habitats. Great harvest. Green Mountain National Forest, the U.S. Forest Service owned, planning, been years. My question is, I heard in this whole restructuring that they were in the Northeast, in the Finger Lakes region, and in the state of Vermont, Rochester, are 2 U.S. Forest Service headquarters that were slated to be closed. Is that impacting? Is that happening? Is my question.
we don't know concretely what the impact of, staffing reductions and reorganizations will be yet on our federal partners. So there's certainly, we've heard things, the reports in the media about what was submitted, I think, earlier this month with a plan for restructuring. But we just don't know what the actual decisions are and what that means for Green Mountain National Forest, Finger Lakes. Certainly, the federal government has said they intend to reduce staffing. So it's plausible to think that the outcome of that will be at this regional level. We're Region 9 for the U.S. Forest Service. Some either reductions in offices or staffing, but it's too soon to say. I do think that I think you're making a good point that if the strategy is through the Fix and Forest Act or the executive order on increasing production to do just that, increase production, that requires staff to do it and do it well. I've said before, it's easy to cut down a tree. It's harder to cut down a tree well and think about water quality, habitat, erosion, et cetera. So any jurisdiction, state, federal, private, we need, trained people to do that work well. And so there is an incongruity between, hey, we're going to increase production while simultaneously closing offices and reducing staffing. So hopefully they'll factor that in and come to decisions that allow them to achieve their active forest management goals, as well as any efficiencies that are trying to achieve with staffing levels. And I think the last point I would just make here, sorry, is we think about what can we do to increase production. New England as a region is extremely forested, but as a region, we only produce 75% of the wood we consume. So even very forested New England relies on wood imports from outside New England to meet our needs. Vermont does produce just over the amount of wood that we consume, but when you look at Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, those are areas that consume a lot more than they produce. So that just speaks to the need to think about how to increase supply if we're going to try to meet our needs more locally. So I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, so the bullet here on the regulatory reform, I think this is really just about providing some efficiencies, some streamlining, some reducing of barriers or burdens, and providing some level of certainty in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty. So if there's opportunities to do that, it would be beneficial to the sector on the whole.
And that report that's in the second from the line from the bottom, that's coming out in June. I think now it was pushed back. We will have it. Maybe we'll still be here in June. I was going to say we'll have it next year, but maybe we'll still be here when it comes out.
The Land Use Review Board is in the lead, but FPR, specifically CAP,
Okay, yeah.
very involved.
Still on track for June?
Yes. We still on track for you?
Yeah.
Better go buy a wood miser.
Yeah.
So just to go on about the creating an environment that kind of spurs or provides some security or enticement for investment in wood products sector is really thinking about just like what can we do to support and encourage and provide level of stability. So knowing that there's access to resources, assistance that's available. So we do myself and representatives from ACCP and other agencies meet with potential manufacturers who come to Vermont and are thinking about siting a facility here to help them identify potential sites, connect them with workforce training, and provide some incentives and supports. The Working Lands Enterprise Initiative is a really big piece along with VEDA. And then one thing that I think is really unique about Vermont as a small state is that we can use that small state to our advantage. Our government is incredibly accessible to our sector. I have a work cell phone. I answer that cell phone. There are people well above my pay grade who also just answer the phone and are there to help and to listen. And that's not the level of kind of customer service that you could get in other states, but it is something that Vermont has. And that is something that is a good sell to any manufacturing industry. I've talked about it before with everyone here, but supporting our low grade markets is really important. The high quality saw log, veneer log is a small piece of the entire tree. And we always, utilization want to have things going to their highest best use whenever we can. And it just makes the whole prospect of forest management for private landowners in particular just economically viable to have those markets. Going to the workforce development, I said it a couple of times, I think just today, about how being able to staff these facilities, whether we're increasing production capacities at our existing mills or bringing in new mills or processing manufacturers, we need to have the bodies, the labor to actually do that work. And that is a challenge that we have. So we have an initiative that we've gotten a Northern Borders Regional Commission grant to support, to connect with our technical schools, tech centers, regional schools, and with the lower grades as well, just to introduce them to forestry, forest products, the sector here in Vermont, and the opportunities that exist. And it is a top priority for our roadmap implementation steering committee. Every time we talk and we think about prioritization, that workforce challenge just is always at the top.
So it's just last slide. As we've said, tariffs are creating uncertainty. It's just unclear if they're here to stay or if they're more of a political bargaining tool that could come and go depending on other factors. And we have some very specific challenges you've heard about in this presentation that's affecting the wood products industry in the Northeast. I just don't know how effective this region will be in influencing national policy when it comes to forest products. The Southeast and the West are either historically have been more influential or sort of have some centers of power. If you look at USDA Forest Service leadership, it's all coming out of the Mountain West states right now. And so the needs of those states may or may not be aligned with ours, but I hope that the needs of the Northeast can be factored into decision-making about tariffs and other national policy issues. I'm concerned that we may not have as much influence as we feel like we should. And then Catherine and I were chatting, and she had some sort of additional pretty interesting thoughts about we can possibly increase production. We might be able to, as we've said, do some things to get additional processing capacity in place, but that's only part of the equation. And I'll sort of hand it off here.
Yeah, so the supply and demand is what we always talk about in economics. And so we can increase supply, but without demand, we're still not going to make the difference or have the outcomes that we want. What we've seen in past years is that the consumer demand for the types of species that we grow here in Vermont and the products that are produced locally, the demand is really stronger out of state or overseas. The consumer preferences here are not for what we have. And until that changes, it could be, this will continue to be a challenge for us.
Yeah, so the last thought of, if we really as a state want to support the industry and take some short-term measures, we could look into things like preferential purchasing or treatment of local wood products through state purchasing and construction contracts, any BGS or AOT-led construction. If we put in place policies or requirements that they have to source wood locally, that could be a benefit, but there's a lot of challenges associated with that. There's also the state and Vermont Economic Development Assistance Authority, or DEDA, has already done this to some extent for providing advantageous grant or loan terms that are backed by state institutions can help as well. But I think we have limited funding and support to do that. And these state-driven market incentives have nuances and pros and cons that must be carefully considered before sort of jumping into that space. So these are ideas that need further deliberation, but thinking about what we can do as a state to support the sector in this period of uncertainty, those are things that at least we feel are worthy of some consideration. So that's the end of our slides. We're happy to take any follow-up questions, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about this with you.
These are all making me think a little bit more, and I do want to see if we can save a little time for another witness, but can you speak just in 30 seconds or so, Oliver, to what other regions might be talking about in their state legislators committee room today? Because it did seem like, and I was first thinking, when Representative Nelson said, why would anybody think this was a good idea? That, it would become clear in Washington at some point that it wasn't a good idea, and that this piece of the trade war might end. But if there are regions of the country where the economics are different, maybe that's not going to happen. Is that what you're suggesting?
We know just in our region, we know that the state of Maine has taken specific steps to support their forest products industry through, funding, through attracting investment, through providing resources to investors. And that's had some payoff. It's also a different context with hundreds of thousands of acres of private lands. supporting a very vibrant and large forest products industry compared to Vermont. But so that's one example. I'll see if Catherine wants to add anything. But yeah, I think to the point, if our interests are aligned with, say, Montana, Idaho, which are perhaps have a better conduit to influence policy in this current federal administration, that could, if they're feeling the same pinch from tariffs that we are, that could be beneficial for the sort of specific challenges we're hearing in the Northeast. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I do think that there's opportunities or some benefits that could come out of this for some other regions that do have products that will be in high demand, and they'll have less competition for the raw materials. But the key challenges that we have here are not just unique to us. So workforce, cost of capital, and the level of uncertainty as to what these market conditions are going to look like long-term, and the demand, that those exist in the South and in the West everywhere. So they still have to navigate those problems, even if they have all of that softwood lumber to build houses. They don't know how many houses are going to be built and remodeled, in 4 years.
I would just add, if what the roadmap gives us is some specific actions that we could implement to support the sector, even with this new context of tariffs being in place or possibly being in place and creating uncertainty. So I think if the committee said, with the resources that are sort of realistic in the state in Vermont, what could we do? We could respond to that by pulling some of the actions from the roadmap, building them out a little bit, and giving some examples of how the state acting through Agency of Natural Resources could provide some support. I know that there's lots of realities that budget wise that we have to work with. So it's something that, we're doing the best we can to implement the roadmap and the strategies that are in there, and we'll continue to do that. That's a 10-year vision, and hopefully that'll help move things forward.
I think as we're changing seats here, if you'd like to come up and speak to us, it would be, yeah, thank you. Sure. I'll just say as we're swapping out seats that if the department feels like it would be helpful to share information like that with us, recognizing that, yes, I mean, there are budgetary constraints, but just getting us thinking, please feel free to do that. Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Chris Castano. I work for a company called Maine Woods Company in Aroostook County, Maine. But I have been in the forest products industry here in Vermont for close to 40 years. So I've seen the devastation, that's happened over a long period of time, not only here in this state, but the whole region. So this particular act couldn't have come at a worse time. As was pointed out by the slides, we've just come off high inflation, rising inflation, higher interest rates the last 2 years. And to add this piece to our situation has basically just stopped any and all sales that are happening right now. This stopping and starting that's happening has just crippled us, and everybody's just sitting on the sideline waiting for some direction.
Can you explain what your business is?
It's a hardwood sawmill owned by Seven Islands or a Pingree family up in northern Maine, but we're a hardwood sawmill. We do about 15 million feet a year, which is average to small.
Who are your customers?
Furniture manufacturers, kitchen cabinet, flooring, pallet, railroad tie for railroads, things like that.
And orders have come to a halt, you said, or?
Have come to a complete halt because nobody knows if tomorrow tariffs are on or off. So
they don't want to pay more if the tariff is going to be off tomorrow when they would pay less. Okay.
Correct. And for Canada's sake right now, the other piece that's not mentioned a lot is there is a 44% exchange rate difference. So you take 25% tariff and you put that on top of a 44% rate difference. It's significant. And so they're not purchasing any lumber right now from the US. So.
Are you in the Millinocket area or even further?
Even further north. Yeah, Ashland. Ashland.
Oh, yeah, Ashland.
Representative Burt?
It sounds like a lot of your market is you're marketing your wood to Canada.
Because of our proximity to the border, I'd say probably 50 to 60% of the log that we cut does go to Canada. And that's pretty much that low grade portion that Catherine alluded to earlier. You know, where we are in a lot of mills in northern New Hampshire, northern Vermont, that low grade does go north into Canada.
In log form,
No, in lumber.
lumber,
camp
okay,
form,
yeah, so you're
Yeah.
taking it down to at least rough cut.
Yes, correct.
But it could be cant, which might be an 8x8 or.
And our chips go up there, our bark goes up there, all the residuals that come off a lot.
Yeah, well, they turn it into OSB board or
Yeah.
whatever.
Nelson.
Yeah, I had a.
I'll add, we'd be better off, honestly, as an industry right now, if we could just, if it's gonna be tariffs, let's just get into it. Let us adapt, let us figure it out. But this stop start is really just.
I remember now. So some fairly modern mills have been built in recent history right across the border from us. I hear it, and perhaps you could tell me, are they heavily subsidized by the Canadian government when they're built?
I mean, that's the rumor, that's the talk. If you ask them directly, they'll shake their heads no. But as you, I believe, alluded to earlier, they've got, or maybe Jed, they've got cheaper electricity, they've got healthcare. They've got all these advantages that we don't have. That
Well, I know that the potato silos and PEI are empty because the Canadian government paid for the transport to the main border.
How did it? Okay.
Yeah, so your neighbors are not real happy.
Right, sure.
So I just wondered if there was that same type of thing in the lumber world.
I think if you ask most lumber people, they would say absolutely yes, they are subsidized. But could they point to what subsidies are there? I don't think they could, but they definitely have some advantage. I also think in Canada, they embrace the wood products industry up there maybe a little more than, maybe what.
A little bit more in Portland, do you think?
Anyway, I'll stop there.
We're talking hall.
Yeah. Sure.
Are there any other questions while we're here as a committee? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you, Oliver, Catherine, for coming in. And if you're available next week and want to sit in while we're hearing from the industry, please do that too. And did you have any final thoughts as we wrap up?
No, I think.
Final thoughts?
Final thoughts are, we'll know more in early April, and we're happy to come back over the course of, the time as the situation evolves, and we'll be working to implement as many of these ideas to support the industry in the interim as we can as FPR.
Great.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.